Welcome back to another episode of Warren Cali. In this episode, I will detail the story of Hoover founder, Hoover Joe. Hoover Joe was born Joseph Stanley around 1957. He was born in Alabama, and by 1959, him and his mom moved to Los Angeles. He was primarily raised by the woman on his mom's side, never knowing his father or his dad's side. At just 4 years old, he would move to 74th Street in South Central. Joe had to mature early in life. His mom would go on to have several kids, leading to him have to take on responsibilities early and taking care of several siblings. Joe lived under tough conditions. His family didn't have a lot, and this led to him having to hustle at a young age to survive. Joe was outside exploring his community at a young age, and in this era in Los Angeles, in the 60s was completely different. In the 60s, Crips and Bloods didn't exist. You had groups like the Black Panthers, the Businessmen, the Gladiators, and the Slossons being the biggest influence among black residents. And this was a hard era to grow up in. There was a lot of racial discrimination and a lot of limitations being black, so many groups were formed to protect each other. This type of environment made Joe and his friends in his area tough. For elementary school, he went to 68th Street School, and with the location of the school and the emergence of a newly formed gang called the Crips, it had many youths in LA following the trend and joining to make a new crews. Joe and his friends started calling themselves the Bonzella Crips. He later went to Bethune Middle School, and at this time the major Crip figures in the world were Raymond Washington and Tookie. They had everyone looking up to them. Just by middle school, Joe was getting into a lot of trouble being a young Crip member, from fights, committing robberies, and hanging with older guys who taught him a lot. He had to be violent and aggressive just to hang out with the older Crips. Off his affiliation to the Crips, Joe was often having run-ins and gang fights with rivals. One of the main rivals for the Crips was the Figueroa Boys, who would later become a blood gang called the Different Lanes. One fight with the Figueroa Boys led to the Crips getting guns pulled out on them. At this time, this wasn't normal. Guns wasn't a factor in the 60s and 70s. It was all about the hands. This night forever changed Joe. He knew he had to take his game banging to another level, knowing everyone was playing for keeps. Feeling the need for a change, Joe and his friends decided to make their own gang after the area they grew up in. This would occur in the early 70s. Joe would decide to name his gang the 74 Hoovers, and he is credited as being the founder. After this, the Hoovers went up and running. They started recruiting all over South Central, East to West, and quickly gained a following. They became popular, and the Hoovers quickly gained the respect among other Crips in Los Angeles. The Hoovers began to push a hard line in the 70s, and other Hoover sets began to emerge, wanting to become a part of the Hoover umbrella. This would later become over 8 different Hoover sets, from 4 Trey to 11 Deuce. Joe would spend a lot of time in jail, from juvenile hall to prison, and in 1978 he would catch a case and do a lot of time for it, and this would become a common occurrence going to jail. While he was in prison, the Hoovers would gain a lot of enemies and become one of the most hated gangs in LA. When Joe was on the streets, the Hoovers had a lot of Crip love, but by the time of his release, the Hoovers were one of the most hated, and they hated Crips the most. By the 90s, this caused the younger Hoover members to drop the identity of Crip as a whole and rename themselves criminals, but a lot of OGs stayed true to their roots, keeping the Crip identity. But some Hoover sets like the 5 Deuce Hoover still claim Crip, and in Hoover lingo, nothing's before the H. Being out of prison by May of 2008, Joe was living in Las Vegas with his wife. He owned a barbershop, and although he lived in Las Vegas, Joe grew up in Los Angeles on West 74th Street between Figueroa and Flower. He still had family in the area, and he often went back. On May 3rd, 2008, Joe traveled from Las Vegas to LA. By 3 a.m., he had reached South Central. A man named Manuel lived in a van, which he parked in front of his family's house on West 74th Street between Hoover and Figueroa. Manuel and his brother Roberto had a nephew named George. Manuel raised George, and George started Manuel as his father. A woman named Kathy also lived on West 74th Street with her mother Jean and her son Devondre, who also lived with them. Around 5 p.m. on May 4th, 2008, George arrived at the woman Kathy's home in an SUV. He wore his head in dreadlocks with the side of his head shaved off. Joe was looking for a man named Ty Moore's family. He knew him as Timo, a childhood friend who used to live in that house. Timo was the father of Devondre. Timo died in 1991. Joe had grown up down the street from Timo and Kathy. Devondre never met his dad though. Kathy and Devondre visited with Joe for about an hour until around 6 p.m. Joe and Devondre eventually left Kathy's house together, crossed the street, and walked towards a nearby group of people. The group of people included George and Manuel. They was hanging out next to Manuel's van. Joe and Devondre joined them. Roberto arrived sometime after dark, and by 8:30 p.m., a man named Carlos had parked his car behind the van. Carlos reclined his seat and remained in his car resting. Everyone was smoking weed and drinking, and Joe and Devondre stayed up to 3 to 4 hours with the group. Joe told Manuel and George that he used to live on 74th Street, but he moved to Las Vegas. According to George, Joe asked Manuel about buying some dope, though George recalled Devondre speaking to Manuel. He did not know who asked Manuel about drugs first. Manuel started making phone calls. George also heard Joe tell Manuel's friend he could triple it out there and make good money. Someone else in the group mentioned guns. George looked around and saw a bulky shape on Joe's waistband. Earlier in the day, Devondre had noticed a black handgun tucked in Joe's waistband. Joe's female friend returned in an SUV and parked across the street. Joe left with the woman. They walked down West 74th Street together and looked at Joe's old house, which was 4 to 5 houses away from where they originally were. Around 8:02 p.m., Joe's mobile phone was used to call Manuel's phone. The call was made within a mile of Manuel's van. While Joe showed the woman his old neighborhood, Devondre waited by the van with Manuel, and they were smoking weed and drinking. At some point, Devondre's brother Rodney joined them. The conversation made George uncomfortable, and he left. As George was leaving, the woman and Joe returned. The woman got back in the SUV, and Joe returned to the group right next to the van. Manuel and Roberto walked down a nearby alley. They returned 15 minutes later, and Manuel went to the van. Roberto stood in the street. Manuel emerged from the van's rear passenger door, followed a few minutes later by Joe. Joe looked directly at Carlos, who was still in his car. Devondre was standing on the grass next to the curve, and Manuel and Joe stood between Devondre and the van. Around 8:45 p.m., Devondre saw a gun flash and heard a shot. Carlos allegedly saw Joe raise his arm and saw muzzle flashes and saw Manuel fall. Meanwhile, Roberto was still standing nearby a street, and Carlos saw Joe walk to the front of a van, then heard more gunshots. As Joe walked past Carlos, it was said that he fired one more time. Devondre and Rodney ran away. Carlos said he saw Joe enter a nearby SUV, and the SUV then drove off really fast. Police responded to the scene minutes later. An SUV was pulling away as they approached. Police found Manuel lying on the grass near his van. He was dead, killed by a gunshot wound to his head. Roberto was lying on the ground between 2 parked cars. He was alive, but died en route to the hospital from multiple gunshot wounds. An hour later, Joe was still in the same neighborhood. He began to drive back to Las Vegas around 10 p.m. and arrived home by the next morning. At the scene, police found 5 used 9mm shell casings and 1 live 9mm round. A search of Manuel's pockets revealed $219 in cash, a phone, and a slip of paper with a phone number that ended up being Joe's, and a name on the paper was JoJo. A search of the van revealed a small bag of white powder. The powder ended up being cocaine. The police collected fingerprints from the van and surrounding items. None of the fingerprints matched Joe's. The shell cases and live rounds were not tested for fingerprints, and police did not swab them for DNA. However, the lab was unable to extract a DNA profile. On October 17, 2008, Devondre was taken into custody for an unrelated murder of a man named Kevin. Devondre was shown a 6-photograph lineup, and he identified someone other than Joe as looking like the shooter of Manuel and Roberto. When the interview was over, police arrested him for the murder of Kevin. Police interrogated Devondre again 4 days later, and this time, Devondre identified Joe as the shooter. Devondre believed the police wanted him to identify someone in the Manuel and Roberto's killing, and thought if he failed to do so, he might be prosecuted for both murders. As police began to question him, they told him up front, "It looks better if you tell us everything right now." He then described the events of May 4, 2008. He explained that the reason he did not identify Joe during their earlier interview was that he feared for his own safety and his family's safety. Police released Devondre from custody that day. He was not prosecuted in either case. He told the police his side of the story, stating he saw Joe raise his arm and saw shots fired. He saw Manuel fall, and that was the same outcome that Roberto would face. He would then say that him and his brother Rodney would then run away. A week later, on October 28, 2008, Joe was arrested in Las Vegas. At the time of his arrest, a search of his house did not uncover any evidence of drug sales or weapons. At trial, another witness testified on the evening of May 4, 2008. He drove to his sister's house on West 74th Street. Before he got out of his car, his friend Manuel called out to him. As he walked towards his sister's house, he saw Manuel speaking with 2 African-American men parked in an SUV. One man had long braids covering his head, and the passenger was nearly bald. He said that Manuel turned away from the man and began walking back to his van. The man got out of the SUV and followed Manuel. He said they were angry and aggressive and cussing, and one carried at least a gun. He noted their shoe sizes, clothing, and their hair. He said the man with braids was wearing a white and blue sleeveless shirt and also denim shorts. The defense emphasized that the testimony was consistent with descriptions that Carlos gave the police. He said that the shooter had long dreads covering his head and was wearing a sleeveless shirt. No physical or fingerprint evidence connected Joe to the crime, and the gun was never found. The only evidence of Joe's guilt came from the statements of an in-custody murder suspect and a cross-racial identification by an eyewitness, a man who could not identify Joe until he saw him in court around a year later. Other evidence placed Joe in the neighborhood around the time of the shooting, and he might have tried to buy drugs from one of the victims, but none of it connected Joe to the murders. However, Joe was charged with 2 counts of special circumstance murder and convicted and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Joe is now 68 years old. He spent 5 years in county jail and by 2013 was sent to prison, where he currently remains with life without possibility of parole. He's still hoping to come home one day with many holes in his case. He's recently had several interviews on the Under the Groove podcast telling his story and the Hoover story. This will conclude this episode. If you haven't already, check out my previous episodes. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.